Okay, great, we're ready. Mhm. Okay, very good, we are live. So thank you very much, as I was mentioning before, for joining, and let us start with our practice for the fourth task of the speaking section, okay? So let me share this with you. And before I, of course, reproduce the different lectures that I have prepared for you, let us just remember very quickly what we have to do in the fourth task, just in case somebody was not present yesterday. And of course, you can take your precautions right before starting with the practice. So we said that in the fourth task of the speaking section, what we have to do is to summarize once again material that ETS gives us. We have to still behave and of course respond to this question as if we were journalists. Remember, here you have the picture. You're going to take notes on a material source that ETS is going to give you, and then your response, the only thing that you're going to do is to summarize the material or information source, no more than that. Remember that you don't have to state your opinion in this task. You don't have to complement the information. You don't have to change the information they give you, but you have to merely summarize it, okay? As we have been doing before in the second and third task. Now, what is the difference of the fourth task when compared to the third task, for example? Well, in this case, we are going to receive merely one information source, as we discussed yesterday. Instead of having a reading passage, we are no longer going to have such a thing. We are just going to receive a lecture about an academic topic in this question, and that is the only information source we'll have to receive. Apart from that, ETS is not going to give us a reading passage. It's not going to give us something else to receive or to analyze. The only thing we receive, the only information source is an audio clip, as you can see here on my screen, and it's basically a lecture, of course, about an academic subject. It can be about biology, physics, mathematics, as you're going to discover while practicing with me tonight. The point is, as I tell you, dear students, this is the only information source, okay? And your only task in this case is to take notes while you listen to this information source, and then you have 20 seconds to prepare a response to decide more or less what is going to be your summary when you are delivering the response in the 16 seconds you have to respond it. As you can see, you have 60 seconds, not 16, sorry, 60, in order to deliver your response, as you had in the second and third task as well. The response time has not varied. What has varied is the preparation time. As you can see, it's 20 seconds now, but apart from that, it's basically the same. We're just summarizing. Remember, we're not giving our opinion. We are not stating anything external, okay? What is the structure? We saw it yesterday. It's a very, very simple four-step structure. First step, you say, right? In this lecture, because it's just a lecture, right? That is the only information source you receive. No more than that. No reading, nothing like that. In this lecture, we've been presented to the fascinating topic of, and here, of course, you mentioned, what is the topic of the entire lecture? Because remember, we also said yesterday that normally professors start their lectures by defining the topic, or let's say clarifying the topic that they are going to discuss in their entire lecture. Therefore, you should also do the same. In your response, the first thing you do is to summarize the definition or clarification of the topic the professor has explained at the beginning of his lecture. So you say, right, in this lecture, we've been presented to the fascinating topic of, for example, it could be opportunity costs, as we saw yesterday, right? And then the rest of the steps are basically reminders for you that all the illustrations that the professors make or mention in their lectures must also be included here in your response, because you're going to notice, as we said yesterday as well, that every single lecture contains that definition or clarification at the beginning, and then the professor offers a bunch of illustrations for his or her students to understand the topic. Therefore, those illustrations the professor mentions, also include them in your summary. As I always say, you don't have to repeat all the expressions as the professors mention them, but what you can do instead is to merely use your own imagination in order to simplify those words. Of course, you are not allowed to give your opinion or to add something new, but what you can do is to receive those expressions that are occasionally difficult to understand or difficult to explain. And what you can do is to simplify that information on your mind and to deliver a summary with those simplified expressions, okay? That is totally legal. You can do so, all right? Very good. Okay, so if there are no questions about this structure, we can continue with the practice, okay? And anyways, all your doubts are going to be clarified here when we practice, okay? So here I have the first lecture. Please take your piece of paper, and as I say, as you listen to this lecture, take your notes, and then you have 20 seconds in order to prepare a summary of that lecture, okay? Let's go then. Here we are. First lecture of tonight's class. Let's go.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a sociology class.
Let's consider the way sociologists use the terms culture and society. A society is a distinct group of people. A sociologist would say that people in a society are defined by their social interactions and the culture they share. Meanwhile, culture itself can be defined as that society's shared knowledge, beliefs, and expectations. Often people think of a society as something really, well, big. And sure, that's true. An entire nation, for example, will generally have some common thread of culture that defines it. The most obvious example is that citizens of one region generally speak a common language. But think about behavioral standards too. Like, what's considered polite or impolite? Whereas in one country you might be expected to take off your shoes as the guest in another's home. In other countries that might be considered strange. Cultural traits like that can extend over enormous populations. But a society can also be much smaller, much simpler. Take this class. Aren't we a society? We have social interactions with each other every week. And I think it's fair to say we have a culture of a sort too. Think back to what happened on the second day of class. Do you all remember? I'd missed my train and didn't have any way to let you all know that I'd be late. But in contrast to other classes, where students might have just headed home 15 minutes after the planned start time, each and every one of you waited the full 30 minutes it took me to arrive. That kind of set expectations, right? It lay the foundation for a culture of patience, something I think is still true of this particular group, this little society.
Using points and examples from the lecture, explain how a society can be a large group of people or a very small group.
Very good. Great. So that's it. As you noticed, that is the first lecture for tonight's class. And as I told you yesterday, this lecture is larger than the ones we received in the third task of the speaking session. Nonetheless, it's not for so much. Let's say as you noticed, right? This entire lecture lasted for 2 minutes and 12 seconds, when normally in the third task, we will have, let's say, lectures lasting for 1 minute and a half, 1 minute and 50 seconds, something like that. But the increment is not so much considerable anyways, okay? Well, now it's time for you to prepare your responses, dear students. And now here I have the 20 seconds for you to do so. As I told you, here, differently to the third and second task, in which we had 30 seconds in order to prepare our responses, we merely have 20 seconds in this fourth task. That is the only thing that is changing, let's say, with regard to the timing. So please take this into consideration, okay? So please, all of you can start preparing your responses and implementing them in the structure we discussed earlier now. Great, very good. Okay, dear students, so now it's time for you to start with your responses. In this case, I would like to listen to Abigail's response first, okay? Please, dear Abigail, you're going to be our first guest tonight. So please, you can start delivering your response for this question now.
Okay, in this lecture, we have been presented to the fascinating topic of society as a large or short group of people. The professor says that social interaction in the culture is what the people share. And they give us some examples about how a society is big. And this is when citizens of share different religions, languages, and some cultural things. And they give us an example, as he gave us an example of take off your shoes when you enter a home. And he says the society is more short, actually.
Okay. Thank you very much, dear Abigail. Very good response. Okay, let us continue with, in this case, our dear Mariana, please. Mariana, you can turn on your microphone and you can start responding to this question now.
Sorry, Mr. I return home. I can participate in the next.
Oh, yes. Okay. Don't worry, dear Mariana. It's okay. It's totally understandable. Great. Well, we're going to have your participation in the next round then. Okay, please, dear Roy, you're going to be our next student to respond in this question. And please, you can start now.
This lecture was about sociality and culture. The teacher says that there are big societies that shares the same traditions that may be different for other societies. For example, in one society, the people have the tradition that not use their shoes at home, but this tradition can be weird for other societies. Other thing he said was that there is a small group of societies. He gave the example that this class can be a small society, and they have their own manners. For example, they wait for the teacher when he was late. This not every class that does do this.
Okay, thank you very much, Roy. Very good response. Okay, so let me please continue with some feedback for both of you. Okay, let me start please with you, dear Abigail. So, well, great. This topic was about, as you said, society and culture. And what the professor did at the beginning of his lecture was to define both concepts, right? He said that a society is a group of people or individuals that share some interactions, whereas culture is actually that shared set of values, traditions, activities, or manners, as Roy said, that a society can share. Now, notice, not every single society has to share cultures. Culture is something independent from a society, according to the professor, right? Because cultures are simply a set of values, ideas, worldviews that people can share. Nonetheless, a society is a group of people in which interactions happen. Now, what the professor did was to continue explaining this further with some illustrations, as I told you he would do. He said, for example, that a society can be large or it can be small. As you said very well, dear Abigail, you said that society can be large or it can be short. And that is exactly what the professor said as well, that large societies can be, for example, in countries, right? Because thousands, millions of people actually work and, well, interact within or with each other, we can say. And of course, they have some sort of communication. They can collaborate together. They can, well, share wars, activities, events, etc. And you also talked about short-term societies. In this case, you, didn't have time to include the illustration the professor gave for that particular topic because he said, right, an example of a short society would be a class. And he gave his own example. In this case, he used his environment, his immediate environment in order to offer an illustration because he said, this class, I think, is a society too, because we have interactions among each other. We discuss, we talk, and etc. Right? And then he also talked about culture. He said culture, for example, could be that in many countries, people take their shoes off, but in other countries, they do not do so. And actually, it could be considered totally weird if you take your shoes off in, let's say, Australia, whereas when you do it in Japan, let's say, it is a very common thing among citizens and people who visit each other's houses. Anyways, and he talked about as well a culture that in his own class was visible to him. He talked and said, you know, when I was in the second day of class, I lost my train came here to the class. And well, every single one of you waited for me for 30 minutes when normally any other class or group of people would have simply departed from that place if I were not arriving on time. And he said, well, that is some sort of culture because from that time on, thenceforth, we have had some sort of culture of patience. We have been, let's say, bearing each other. We have been tolerating each other since that time, right? Well, you didn't have time to mention that, of course, and you didn't have time to mention and talk to all that experience that the professor discussed, but it's fine. I know that you, of course, took notice of it, but as I say, how can we measure, in this case, our time so that we can include all the information? It's a matter of practice. Go about in any response, measuring by yourself. Okay, let's say if I spent 15 seconds clarifying or defining the concepts that the professor mentioned at the beginning, am I going to have enough time to continue with the illustrations he offers? Think about that and okay, try. Well, in this response, I'm gonna use 15 seconds to the first part and 20 seconds for each illustration, something like that, and go testing. Or you can change in the next response. You can, for example, use, okay, I'm gonna use 20 seconds for my explanation of the concepts, and I'm gonna use merely 10 seconds for each illustration. Test, okay, you can prove, you can test this in each response we're gonna have, okay? Dear Abigail, but very good. And then Roy, you offer us a very good summary. You talked about society also. What is a society? What is a culture? And in this case, you did have time to mention, well, the illustration the professor gave about a very short society with its own culture. Maybe you struggle a little bit. At the end of the response, you ran out of time to talk about the culture, right? That they shared this culture of patience, quoting him. But anyways, as I say, it's a matter of measuring by yourself the time, by practicing and testing in each of your responses a different distribution to the time you have available for you to respond, okay? And I like the fact that you mentioned, for example, the word manners. That is very good, dear Roy. You are including advanced vocabulary. You said manners, right? They had their own manners, you said, and that is a very advanced word when you say their traditions, the way to act, the way to behave they have. Very good, Roy. That is a very good thing to always mention an advanced words if you have the opportunity, dear students. If you know a word that it is not very much common, and of course would bring to you some sort of feeling of professionality, scholarship, please introduce it in the response if you are able to, okay? Let's go with another example. We have more practices. Let's go with the next one. Here we are. Okay, so please, dear students, I hope that Mariana is going to be able to join us as well. But let's go with the next exercise, okay? Here we have it. Let's go.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a physics class.
Have any of you wondered how exactly planes are able to fly even though they're so much heavier than air? There are actually a couple of ways we can answer that. The first way, the easier way I think, is based on Newton's third law. That law says that when you push something, there is push back. So think about a wing. It's slanted up, right? The front of the wing is higher than the back. And as the plane moves through the air, that air goes under the wing. It gets pushed down by the slant. And when that air is pushed down, as we said, it has to push back. It pushes up. So there's a lot of air getting pushed down by that angle of the wing. And it's all pushing back up, pushing the plane into the air. The second answer has to do with something called Bernoulli's principle, which is about how fluids work. And when I say fluids, that includes gases too, not just liquids. This principle, it says that as the speed of a fluid, in this case air, as the speed of the air decreases, pressure increases. And also, as speed goes up, pressure goes down. So, in other words, the faster the air is moving, the less the pressure. The slower it is moving, the more the pressure. Get it? Speed and pressure are opposite. They're inversely correlated. We won't worry too much about how this works, but just know that because the way a wing is designed, air moves faster on the top of the wing than on the bottom of the wing. So that means the air on top, where the air is moving fast, has low pressure, and the air on the bottom of the wing, where the air is moving slowly, has high pressure. The difference in pressure pushes the wing upward into the sky.
Using points and examples from the lecture, summarize the two explanations of how planes are able to fly.
Okay, very good. There we are. Very interesting lecture, right? In this case, about physics, maybe a topic that is not very much simple for average people like us, but of course, unless you are, let's say, an engineer or something like that. But anyways, right, we have to be prepared for any type of topic we can receive. So please, dear students, you have the opportunity to start preparing your responses now. Very good. Okay, dear Roy, please, you're going to make the honor here to start with this round. And you can please start responding this question now.
This topic was about how planes can fly, and the teachers give us two explanations. The first is about the third law of Newton that says that every action have a reaction, and he explained the way that the wing have a force that is going up and the air have a force that is going down, and this is the way how the wing help the plane to fly. And the second explanation is about a question of Bernoulli that is about the it's about the air being a fluid. So this has to be about the pressures. He explained the way that the wing had pressures in the top of the wing and the bottom of this.
Okay. Thank you very much, dear Roy. Fantastic. And now let us continue with you, please, dear Abigail. We're going to continue, and you can start delivering your response for this question now.
Okay, in this lecture, we have been presented to the fascinating topic of how planes are able to fly. The professor says when you push something, it can be pushed down and pushed back into the earth. He says how the wind is designed in order to high pressure. When the plane flies low, they increase his high pressure, and when the plane fly faster, they are using low pressure.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, dear Abigail. Okay. And now please let us finalize this round with you, dear Mariana. You can please start responding this question now. Okay, shall we start again, dear Mariana? Okay, you can please start responding now. Okay, I guess Mariana is still arriving home. If you are able to respond, dear Mariana, you can send a message, and of course, you're going to have the chance to do so, okay? Great, so until that happens, I'm going to start with the feedback to Roy and Abigail then. Roy, we're going to tell about your response. Well, it was very good. I think that you summarized the topic very well. It was a very complicated topic, as I say, In this case, well, the professor explained why airplanes, when they are very much heavier than air, can fly, right? Which is a very interesting question, actually. And he says it is due to, let's say, explain in a very easy manner, two principles. The first one, third Newton's law. The second one, the Bernoulli's principle. Now, he said that the third Newton law, as you said very well, dear Roy, basically postulates that for every single action, there is an opposite and equal reaction, right? Well, and the professor explained that this principle is put into practice when the wings of the airplane, in combination with the tail of the airplane as well, basically push when they are in a certain angle, right? When they are elevating, they push down a quantity of air that is pushed back by the mere architecture and composition of the airplane, and that allows the airplane, of course, the transportation means to elevate because the air is pushing back when the wings, as I mentioned, and the tail are pushing air downwards. The reaction, because of third Newton law, is that the air is also pushed back, in this case upwards, by, as I mentioned, the architecture and mechanism of the airplane. Very good, you explained that. And you also talked about Bernoulli's principle, and you also here mentioned the detail that the professor said that applies to air as well, even when air is not, let's say, our most general definition of a fluid, right? Because Bernoulli's principle is for fluids, he says, but gases are also fluids, and you included that in your response. Very good. That is also good when we have the chance to include details, right? But certainly our primordial preoccupation or worry should be to include, of course, the main ideas and points in the lecture. Anyways, very good. And you talked about how this correlates to fluids when they are somehow interacting with velocity. That is to say, when the air is going faster, that means that the pressure decreases, and when the air is going, well, let's say, in this case, lower, that means that the pressure increases, and this dynamic between such phenomena produces the wings of the airplane to elevate. Okay, very good. Dear Roy, you explained that very well. Fantastic. And then we also had your response here, Abigail. You said yes. And here, for example, something that you did, you summarized it completely. You summarized the lecture very well, but you didn't mention, for example, the titles of both principles, right? You didn't say the third Newton law, or you didn't mention Bernoulli's principle, like the terms, right? You didn't say those words. But although you didn't mention those words, you did explain what these principles are all about. And that is fantastic. As I say, it is not necessary to mention every single term or terminology present in the lecture into your response. You can actually, as I say, explain it with your own words, as you did, and that is great, as I mentioned. Never feel forced or obligated to mention every single term or word you listen to in the lecture, but you can actually take that, understand it, process it on your mind into the leaflets as easy as you can with your own words, as Abigail did in this case. And it was very good because she said, when air pushes down, then it pushes upwards. Fantastic. That is exactly what we mean by the third Newton law, right? And well, then she said, well, with regards to fluids and its interaction and relationship towards airplanes, when the air goes faster, then the pressure decreases. And when pressure is high, it means that the air is moving slower. Fantastic. You summarized Bernoulli's principle without actually mentioning it was Bernoulli's principle, right? So as I say, it's great. You don't have to actually mention those terms. Okay, very good, Abigail. Let us try to anyways controlate the time a little bit more, to mention more details if you are able to, okay? And well, Mariana, are you able to respond, dear Mariana? Or should we continue to the next topic and then you can respond?
Not yet.
Yes, not yet? Okay, well, let's go. Let's go to the next topic then, and then you're going to accompany us, okay? All right, great. Let me please go to the next practice. We have another one. Here I have it handy. Just give me a sec. Here, and here, here. Okay. There you are. Awesome. So let us listen to this new lecture, and please take your notes. Listen very carefully because this is going to be our next exercise. Let's go.
Now, listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
Let's talk about two kinds of biological selection. Two different ways that traits are selected in a species of animal as it breeds and reproduces. First, there's natural selection. Here, living things develop features that help them survive in a certain kind of climate, escape from a certain kind of predator, that sort of thing. In contrast, we have artificial selection. Artificial selection happens outside of what we'd call nature. It happens when people deliberately breed living things for their own use. Now, it's true that natural selection and artificial selection both give a living thing the traits it needs to reproduce and survive. But these two types of biological selection also have very different effects, obviously. Maybe one of the easiest places to see this difference is with wolves and dogs. Let's start with wolves. So, what's a wolf's job? It's to survive in the wild and get enough to eat, right? So certain qualities are naturally selected. Wolves need keen senses so they can detect prey. They need to be fast, strong, and aggressive to catch their prey, and to survive even in the harshest weather. Wolves that are born with these qualities live longer and pass the qualities on to their pups. That's natural selection. But a dog's job, its role in its environment, is a little different. Dogs don't need to survive in the wild. They need human protection. So to survive, a breed of dog needs to have traits that humans want. Take the golden retriever. People bred a dog big enough to be a good hunter, but not so big that it was hard to control. And it had to be obedient, unlike a wolf, right? A golden retriever has to be, well, friendly in order to be well-liked enough that we humans decide to breed it, so we can get similarly friendly puppies, more pets.
Using points and examples from the talk, explain the two types of biological selection.
Very good. Dear students, let us start then with this new round of responses, given that we have listened to this biology lecture, right? Well, let's go. You have 20 seconds to design and prepare those responses, and please, you can start now. Okay, very good. Please, dear Abigail, you're going to make the honors in this case. You can please start delivering your response for this question now.
Okay, in the lecture, we have been presented to the fascinating topic of natural selection. There are two kinds of natural selection, as the professor says. Natural selection and artificial selection in order to reproduce and survive. The professor gave us two examples. The first one is about the wolf, which have to survive in a wild environment. They have to be strong and be and take care of the predators. And the other example of artificial selection is dogs, because they don't need to survive in a wild environment because humans take care of them. That's all.
Okay. Thank you very much, dear Abigail. Fantastic. And now let us continue with our dear Roy. Please, Roy, you can start responding this question now.
This lecture was about biological selection, and the professor gave us two examples. The first example is about natural selection, and he says that wolves, for example, in their environment, they have the need of surviving. For this task, they develop some aspect that help them to survive. and they pass these things to their children. And the second example was artificial selection, and he gave us the example of dogs. Dogs don't have the same needs as wolves because they live with humans, so the they develop different things. For example, they are more obedient. That don't is not the same for wolves, because this will help them to be with humans.
Great, fantastic. Thank you very much, Roy. And oh, I think that Mariana left, right? The reunion. Well, we're going to be waiting for her. Okay, very good. So let us go with feedback for both of you. All right. So Abigail, in this case, you offered very good response. You know, this topic was about biological selection, as both of you said. And the professor discussed two types of biological selection. The first one, natural selection, and the second one, artificial selection. The professor said that natural selection is basically the development, right, of certain characteristics and features for wild animals to survive and to reproduce. And he offered one example, that is to say, wolves, right? He talked about wolves and how he said that wolves exemplify this procedure because they basically develop features and characteristics, like, for example, very keen senses, in order for them to be very good hunters and, of course, to take care of predators, as in this case, Abigail mentioned, very good, Abigail, that detail there, the predators thing. And well, he also said that wolves certainly have this objective, right, of surviving. And in order to survive, reproduce, they need to have these qualities. Now, he also talked about artificial selection, and this type of synthetic, selection is basically a process in which animals have a different set of objectives as the ones that wild animals have. In this case, this different set of objectives is basically defined as the need or necessity to be, let's say, cared or to be sustained by human beings. And what the professor expressed was that, for example, dogs illustrated this process very well, given that their need to have human protection and care obligated them to develop different qualities to those that wolves develop. And he said that dogs, in this case, for example, are able to create capacities to be very much obedient and, let's say, friendly towards human beings, which enables them to receive such protection and care by persons. And that way they survive, of course, and reproduce as well. But of course, the difference and the need is different because wolves develop, let's say, capacities to survive by themselves, whereas dogs, when practicing artificial selection, develop characteristics and qualities, a set of skills for them to receive help to survive by human beings, which is, of course, the difference between these two selections, right? Very good, Abigail. I think that you summarized that very well in your response, and you took your time, right, to do so. Very good, Abigail. And also, Roy, here you were very much specific when mentioning this. You summarized both type of selections, and I like the fact that you also mentioned, for example, you explained it with your own words and with a very much understandable narrative, let's say, because you talked about different needs that animals have. Wolves, for example, having the need to survive by themselves, and dogs having the need to please human beings, right? And by that narrative, you explained the topic, and it was very easy to follow. Fantastic. That's what I mean when I say try to express all this information with your own words, and that's it, because you make it understandable, easy to follow. You make it more, integrated to the entire lecture. Very good. Okay, let us continue then with the next exercise. Here I have it, prepared for you. Let's go. All right. Okay, here we have it. So please let us listen to this new lecture, dear students. Okay, let's go.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a literature class.
In the 8th century BC, a legendary author named Homer wrote two epic poems. You probably know them already, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They're fascinating poems, really, partly because they give us such a clear window to the culture of the time. But what culture or what period of Greek history was Homer describing? His own era or an earlier one? It's an interesting question, but it's very likely there's no real answer. You see, Homer was working in the oral tradition. Before he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey down, poems were told and retold by generations of storytellers. Each generation added details to the poems, so it's likely that these poems are actually this. They're an interesting mixture of historical details about a bunch of different time periods. So let me give you a couple of examples. Here's one. Homer describes helmets made out of boar tusks. Well, just these kinds of helmets have actually been discovered in sites dating back to the 2nd millennium BCE in Greece. They weren't used in later time periods. That's a pretty clear indication, right? So clearly Homer's poems preserved some authentic details about the distant past, and some would argue that's the era Homer intended to write about. But then we take a look at another detail and it's a bit more nebulous. Homer describes chariots, horse-drawn wagons carrying warriors into battle. He describes them as simply carrying troops on and off the battlefield. That might be how chariots were used in Homer's time, sure, but in earlier history, the time when those helmets might have been used, say, they were used in battles themselves. The chariots, that is. So this is a good example of Homer adding details from his own world into the poems.
Using points and examples from the talk, explain why the professor thinks there is no real answer to the question of what period of history Homer described.
Okay, great. Well, let us go then with the practice for this new topic, dear students. Okay, both of you can start preparing your answers for this question now. Awesome. Okay, dear Roy, I would like to listen to your response. And please, you can start delivering it now.
This lecture was about Homer and his famous poem, the Iliad. The teacher says that there is a problem with this poem that is that no one can says the era when the poem takes place. It takes place in the era of Homer or before. And this is because at all the time, people add new things to his poem. For example, they in the poem are specific details about helmets, but this helmet was for a different era that Homer belonged. Other examples are charts. This way they use this in words is a specific detail that doesn't belong to the Homer era. And this is why the teacher thinks that there is a problem knowing which era this poem belongs.
Great, thank you very much, Roy. Fantastic summary. And now, please, dear Abigail, make us the honor to respond to the question starting now.
Okay. In this lecture, we have been presented to the fascinating topic of poems. Likewise, the professor talked about two important poems about Homero, the Iliad and Odyssey, and he is wondering about what period these poems take place, and he shares two kinds of parts when Homer describes his poems. Where the one part is when he describes board tasks and details about words, and the second one he described what's happening in the 2nd millennium. Details into his poems.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Abigail. There we are. Okay, great. Thank you, dear students. Okay, so, well, this topic was about Homer and how he wrote two very famous poems, right? The Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, in this case, I'm gonna start with you, Roy. So you offered a very good response, Roy. I like the fact that at the beginning of your response, you clarify very well what this lecture was all about. And that is fantastic because, as I told you, the first step is always to clarify and, of course, to define the main idea or topic of the entire lecture, as you did in this case, because you said, right, the professor mentions two different poems, but in this case, you didn't mention the Odyssey, you just mentioned the Iliad, right? But it's just a detail, don't worry. It's very good anyways. The professor talked about the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? And he said, well, at what times or what times do these poems describe? Are they describing Homer's times, or are they are they describing otherwise any period or epoch in human history that is not Homer's times? And you explained that very well. As I mentioned, you had a very much important facility to describe this particular scenario that, of course, is discussed in further depth during the lecture. Very good, Roy. And then you talked about two different, let's say, hints or events that made this hesitancy and this doubt and concern about the time these poems are describing. When you talked about, for example, how these helmets during Homer's time are described indeed in the poems Homer wrote, the Iliad and the Odyssey. But and of course, the professor says that the material these helmets were made of is the one that, of course, would have been normal to find in Homer's times. But nonetheless, the second event, that is the chariots, he mentions in his poems, do not actually correspond to Homer's times because the way they were used in the battlefield was very different to Homer's time. Because in Homer's time, chariots merely, let's say, brought troops to the battlefield, but they didn't take out the troops and soldiers from the battlefield. So that was the difference that, of course, made it difficult to calculate at the end what period of human history were these poems describing. I think that you did it fantastically, dear Roy. Very good. And well, dear Abigail, well, in your case, it was also very good. Maybe you had some, troubles understanding the content. Maybe you confused some ideas, but that is normal. Don't worry. I mean, they are very much, let's say, they are very much patient when you have this type of confusions, because trust me, it's very normal that sometimes you lose a particular word, or sometimes you get deconcentrated for 2 seconds and you don't listen to a very, very important sentence that clarifies, the meaning, of course, the sense of the lecture. And of course, that's the reason maybe you confuse some terms and some ideas during the lecture, but don't worry, that is totally normal. They know this, and of course, it is very likely that this happens to us sometimes because it is just 2 minutes, right? If we were, for example, listening to something that lasts for, let's say, I don't know, 15 minutes or something like that, it will be too easy, right? Like super easy for us to understand the meaning and to understand the idea, because in that case, we were, or we would be listening to, let's say, 15 minutes of the same topic. And at the end, with those 15 minutes, it would be impossible for us not to identify the main ideas and their correlation. But in this case, we're just listening to 2 minutes, right? So it's okay, don't worry. But as I say, we can improve this by practicing a lot. And as I mentioned, trying to always simplify the words and pay more attention to the lecture instead of the notes. Maybe something that happens to you is that you are very much concentrated taking notes, that maybe you're missing 1 or 2 important sentences during the lecture that, as I say, make the entire sense of the lecture and exposition. So as I say, try to pay more attention to the lecture instead of taking notes. As I told you, taking notes is just a result of your listening, but you shouldn't be focused on taking the notes, because notes as such are not evaluated. They're simply work because they are reminders to us of the topics and things we are listening, okay? So anyways, it was very good here, Abigail. Okay, let's go with the next topic. You can listen, dear students. Now.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a physical science class.
So, in the early 20th century, there was this big debate going on in the scientific community. Did very small stuff like electrons behave like particles? Or did electrons, these negatively charged things that whirled around the nucleus of the atom, did these electrons actually behave like something else? Well, for a long time, it was assumed that because electrons were discrete, because electrons seem to be individual objects with specific energy levels, for a long time it was assumed that electrons were simply small particles. But then, the double-slit experiment happened. In the double-slit experiment, electrons are shot at a screen containing two long vertical holes. The positions of the electrons after they go through the screen are captured on film. Now, experimenters expected that the results of the experiment would be simple, because, well, they thought that electrons were like small particles. They guessed that the electrons that went through the two slits would create a pattern of two narrow bands, or lines, on the film. However, this is not at all what the experimenters saw. Instead, they were shocked that the electrons formed an interference pattern, one by one, on the film. Now, in other words, the electrons randomly scattered all over the film in a wave-like pattern, instead of collecting in two narrow bands and creating the pattern that particles would make. So, the double-slit experiment was significant because it forced scientists to rethink the nature of electrons. They realized that electrons, like light, have characteristics of both particles and waves. Like particles, they collected one by one on the film. But like waves, they formed a complex interference pattern on the film, instead of forming two neat lines. And the results of the experiment? Well, they're discussed, debated, and reproduced to this day.
Okay, let us start with a preparation time now. Okay, dear students, it's time for you to respond. Please, dear Abigail, you're going to start this round and you can start now.
Okay, in this lecture, we have been presented to the fascinating topic of the discovery of electrons. The professor says that they are experimented in the 20th century, and they are explaining what the electron contains. And he says there are two theories. The first one, electrons can contain individuals, objects that are more complex. And the second one is the electron can contain small particles. They are united one by one, and they can create some different kinds of partners. That's all.
Great, thank you very much, guys. Fantastic, thank you for your response, Abigail. And now, please, dear Roy, you can start responding to this question now.
This lecture was about electrons, and the teacher told us about there is a discussion in the scientist world about electrons, if the electrons are particles or if they are something else. This is because for a long time, electrons were considered like particles because we get a lot of information about these properties. But when they use a specific experiment that is a double film panels, these electrons have a different results in this experiment because they don't be like particles, they didn't do the thing that we think that they should do if they were particles. They did something else that hasn't been explained what kind of thing they were mannered to.
All right. Thank you very much for it. Well, fantastic, dear students. I have to congratulate you. You have done a fantastic job throughout these practices. And well, I think that this last response was very good. Of course, we are improving every single time, constantly. And well, I now have the opportunity to make your present. Here you have a video that I was preparing this afternoon for you with a lot of practices for the 4th task of the speaking section, so that you can practice in your free time and of course, constantly improving your level at this type of discipline. Okay, so please, there you have it. Use it whenever you can. And trust me, this is going to be a huge resource for you to practice and to have fruitful resources and fruitful results. Okay, very good. So we're going to stop here tonight's class. And I'm going to tell your assistants before you go. So please, as I do that, give me just a sec. All right, isn't this? And well, I'm going to tell your assistants and help me please with your kind responses to our daily poll. Okay, as I tell your assistants, if you have any question, any commentary, please let me know. Okay, let's look for you guys. Right, here we are. So here we have Abigail Garciela.
Present.
Thank you very much, dear Abigail. And finally, we have Roy Bryan.
Present.
Thank you very much, Roy. Great, there you are, guys. Fantastic. So thank you very much, as I say, for your presence tonight. It was always a pleasure. And see you tomorrow to start the writing section. Okay, have a wonderful night.
Thank you. Bye, teacher.